timer? That's what I think. He was trying to make me yeah, already starting late. Keep it at 12. It automatically runs back yeah, I don't really come back. You know, it's
Moderator for this session. My academic focus here at Tufts is on the interface between peace and justice, climate change, and international policy and law. So, a question that was asked to me is, why is it important that we talk about and seek solutions to the threat of climate change in a symposium that's entitled The World of Tomorrow, Order and Chaos in the 21st Century? Well, climate change, which former U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry famously called a weapon of mass destruction, is a threat to order and a potential creator of chaos on a global scale in the 21st century. So, a number of authors have pointed out that climate change both serves as a threat multiplier for many existing threats and as generator for an entirely new array of threats with which we must now contend. So in 2015, the U.S. Department of Defense National Security Strategy concluded that it is, quote, clear that climate change is an urgent and growing threat to our national security, contributing to increased natural disasters, resource flows, and conflicts over basic resources such as food and water. But climate change is not just a DoD or a U.S. problem. Climate change is the quintessential international challenge. Its cause and its solutions make a mockery of national borders and traditional security and control regimes. So climate change will require international, governmental, private sector, and even NGO collaboration to combat it. Since the scope, scale, and intensity of climate change impacts are projected to increase over time, climate change is not just a current threat. It's a threat to global order and a potential cause of chaos for decades and generations to come. People around the world who are not yet born will be dealing with this issue. Thus, it will be an issue in the world of tomorrow for the people of tomorrow. So this is why we're talking about the issue today in a symposium on stability and chaos in the 21st century. We're very lucky to have here with us today 3 speakers who have each been leaders in identifying and addressing climate change-related challenges: Dr. Berkman, Dr. Kirshen, and Dr. Titley. We also have you, the audience, with us. We hope that you will share your unique perspectives with us and with each other through questions and through our breakout sessions. We'll be following our normal panel structure, more or less. We've given our 3 speakers 15 to 20 minutes to speak, and they've promised not to go over that. After that, we'll have some time for discussion and questions, so please hold your applause to the end. So, without any further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Paul Berkman. Dr. Berkman serves as a professor of practice in science diplomacy here at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. Dr. Berkman is the current coordinator of the Pan-Arctic Options Project through the Belmont Forum, involving NSF funding, agencies in the United States, Canada, China, France, Norway, and the Russian Federation from 2015 to 2020. He is also the director of the U.S.-Russia Relations Project through the Carnegie Corporation. The project includes a science diplomacy course, which is taught weekly this spring via video teleconference between here at the Fletcher School and MGIMO University in Moscow. He's the former head of the Arctic Ocean Geopolitics Program at the University of Cambridge, where he coordinated the first formal dialogue between NATO and Russia regarding environmental security in the Arctic Ocean, and he is the recipient of too many national and international awards to list here. He will be talking on climate change in context. Dr. Berkman, you have 20 minutes.
So the context is what I will try and talk to you about. But I would say first and foremost, looking at the young audience, that my greatest responsibility in this discussion is to offer you hope and inspiration. And I would say that is the most basic responsibility that every generation has in terms of their acts, in terms of their deeds, in terms of their words. So climate, as we know, is a very politically charged discussion. And I'd like to try and put this in terms of context so that we can work together as a civilization to scale. So the entire Earth. About 30% of the Earth's surface falls within the boundaries of nations. Collectively, that 30% of the Earth's surface can be described in terms of national interests. The remainder of the Earth, areas like the high seas and deep sea and Antarctica, as well as outer space, the 70% of the Earth explicitly falls beyond sovereign jurisdictions in areas that are defined in terms of common interests. And I would argue the most basic challenge we have as a civilization, now and forever, as long as there are nations, is to balance national interests and common interests. So in this process is science, and I have the pleasure and honor to be engaged in a very interesting way with a new activity called science diplomacy. I'd like to share with you briefly, some of its dimensions. So in terms of the problems we face collectively as a civilization, planetary scale, defining the dimensions of those problems, the changes over time and space, whether it's the natural sciences or the social sciences, gives us perspective in terms of time and space. Science is an instrument for Earth system monitoring and assessment. We discover things like the ozone hole because of science, for example. Science is an early warning system. Science is also a source of invention and commercial enterprise. So we invent technologies and tools, internet, etc. It comes from science. Science is a determinant of public policy agendas. Science is an element of international institutions. Science is a subsidiary means for the determination of rules of law. Science is an element of continuity in our global society. So if we think about the challenges we face today of going from the present into the future, we need to identify solutions that have continuity across time. I can only identify two. One is science and the other is religion. And these intersect in ways that create stability in the world. And most importantly, and there are ample lessons after World War II, where science has served as a tool of diplomacy, fostering inclusive dialogues to protect our common welfare in the world we live in. So by way of context, if we think about climate, which is the discussion here, just in terms of definition, climate is a planetary scale process. Climate operates in every planet in our solar system. They have their own climate. Earth has a climate, Mars has a climate, Jupiter has a climate. All of these climates are forced by the sun. So when we talk about climate, just in terms of context, we're talking about a planetary scale process. It's not something that happens or can be defined over political or geologic timescales. It's something that happens to our entire solar system. In terms of technology, fundamental change happened at the end of the 1950s during a period called the International Geophysical Year, which brought 67 nations together to study the Earth as an integrated activity. And the very first satellite was launched during the International Geophysical Year. For those of you that are interested in history, the very first U.S. space policy in 1955 was that the United States was going to launch a scientific satellite during the International Geophysical Year. The United States and Russia, Soviet Union, launched the satellites during the International Geophysical Year. At that point, we began to have synoptic coverage of the entire Earth simultaneously from outer space. So at that point, understanding climate, understanding the planet became possible because we could measure it on a planetary scale. If we look through time, these are ice core records from Antarctica. We see changes in the Earth. It goes through phases. It goes through warm phases and cold phases. And when we talk about climate, we really are talking about those warm phases and cold phases. They're influenced by the sun, certainly, and its rotation and the Earth's rotation around the sun. And also, in our civilization today, they're influenced by our activities. It's not just greenhouse gases. As long as we've had agriculture and changed the surface of the Earth, we have been influencing our climate. The climate itself is an integrated process that involves the geology and chemistry and the physics, as well as the biology on Earth. And probably the most significant climate change in the history of the Earth was the production of oxygen about 1 billion years ago by small plants. And those plants created oxygen that made the Earth habitable for us animals. If we think in terms of this oscillation between warm and cold periods, in effect we have a sea level seesaw. During warm periods, the sea level rises because the glaciers melt. During cold periods, the water from the ocean is locked in the ice sheets and sea level falls. And so what we see is an oscillation between warm periods and cold periods, locked in the ice sheets. We also see it in terms of sea level. And so these types of influences, you can see, are planetary in process. It's not limited to one region or another. They're planetary in scale. And the essence of climate in context is that it's a planetary scale process. In terms of our civilization, so the notion of thinking about challenges and opportunities, as Admiral Stavridis introduced this morning, thinking about it in terms of our civilization, the oldest calendars that we have in the world are on the order of about 6,000 years old. So thereabouts. Continuous records of populations year after year for 6,000 years. Through stone, through clay, through papyrus, through paper, and now through digital, we record time. The calendar was reset around 2,000 years ago. And much of what I'm going to tell you about the context of climate change happened in the last century. So putting it in context in terms of our civilization, 60 centuries, 6,000 years of that record, it's only really the last 1/60th of that time period when we began to operate as a globally interconnected civilization. So putting things in context. We talk about climate as a significant forcer. We cannot talk about the Earth and our global interconnections without talking about human population growth. In terms of global human population growth, in all of the centuries and all of the millennia that we've been around on this planet, we only achieved the first billion people alive at the same time in around 1800. And if necessity is the spice of invention, it's probably not coincidental that around 1800 we also began the Industrial Revolution. So there is synergies between the global human population growth and events that we see on a planetary scale. In 1927 or thereabouts, we reached the second billion people alive at the same time. By 1974, thereabouts, there were 4 billion people alive at the same time. And by the end of this decade, there will be 8 billion people alive at the same time. So if we think in terms of the context of problems and solutions and planetary scale, we cannot deal with them absent recognizing global human population growth. In terms of context, in terms of a message, in terms of a public dialogue, I would argue as a globally interconnected civilization that we're just in our infancy. If we consider that we have been recording time for 60 centuries, in a sense it was only the last century when we truly became globally interconnected. And we're just in our infancy. If we think about the discussions, the public discussions about climate, in effect, like an infant, we're crying about them. We're bumping into things. We're making mistakes. But the notion of an infant has two features. One of the features is that an infant is hopeful. An infant will mature. An infant will grow over time to a young adult and to an adult and so on, lessons learned. And so if we think about our civilization in context, we're just in our infancy in thinking about how to manage activities on a planetary scale. And the dialogue about climate is front and center in terms of that trajectory, in terms of thinking about the Earth in an interconnected civilization context. The other thing about an infant is it is the most vulnerable stage of a species' life. So in terms of the world that we live in, we're also living during the most vulnerable stage. We have to mature beyond our infancy into a state where we are operating together as a system on a planetary scale. This envelope right here that you see from atmospheric turbulence and nutrient cycles and cesium production and populations and evolution and extinction, El Nino, global weather patterns, all of those are wrapped into our climate. The climate itself is the integrated response of everything that's happening on the surface of the Earth on a planetary scale. So just in terms of context, understanding that is fundamental. Now, the question here really related to chaos and looking across the 21st century. And Admiral Stavridis hinted to this in his presentation. If we look at the 20th century, in the history of all of the centuries that we've had people growing civilizations on Earth, arguably, it was only the last century when we truly became a globally interconnected civilization. The first part of the 20th century was marked by animosity among nations, the concept of world wars. These were not regional wars. They weren't continental wars. They were world wars. Our world, planet Earth, was at war. 2 wars in the first part of the 20th century. And I would argue that a component of that certainly was related to global human population growth. The second part of the 20th century sheds more optimism and hope on the dialogue. After the development of the United Nations in 1945, the global community began to develop regions that were beyond sovereign jurisdiction. The first of those regions was the high seas in 1958. The second was the Antarctic Treaty in 1959. Third was outer space in 1967, and the fourth was the deep sea in 1971. If we think about sources of conflict, the notion of national interests are related to boundaries and borders. In effect, by setting aside international spaces that are explicitly beyond sovereign jurisdictions, humankind was reducing sources of tension on a planetary scale. This is hopeful. And if we look at the 20th century together, in a sense, the first part of the 20th century can be defined in terms of national interests. The second part of the 20th century, where we began to deal with treaties and conventions that related to issues or impacts or resources that extended beyond the boundaries of nations or across the boundaries of nations, those were defined in terms of common interests. And so I went through and I described some of the lessons relating to science, and that one of them is to characterize issues, impacts, resources in terms of time and space. Climate itself operates on a planetary scale, where we have national interests and common interests. If we look across time, same type of observation exists. The 20th century, there was a period of national interests and a period of common interests. The area of science diplomacy. So earlier this morning, Admiral Stavridis identified the challenges and the opportunities. I'd like to talk about the solutions. As we go forward as a civilization, and I would argue realistically, the challenge is to balance national interests and common interests on a planetary scale. We cannot arrive just at the balance. We first have to build common interests among nations. And science is a tool to build common interests among nations. For those of you that are in the military, young military officers, as a discrete example, when I was at the University of Cambridge in 2010, I convened the first formal dialogue between NATO and Russia involving environmental security in the Arctic Ocean. Now, I didn't do this because I was a member of a government or an NGO or a business. I did this from the position of a scientist. In that position, I was able to bring together a dialogue among adversaries and allies alike to consider their common interests. And the first step in terms of balancing national interests and common interests is to first build common interests. And one of the values of science diplomacy on a global scale is to build common interests. In all of these discussions and challenges and efforts that you will contribute to, it's important to recognize the solutions, the dimensions of the challenges and the problems. They're international and they're interdisciplinary. But the biggest challenge of them all is to think in terms of inclusion, to think in terms of inclusive solutions. We have different stakeholder perspectives. Not one is right or the other is right. There are certainly areas of common interest. We have different types of evidence from the natural sciences and the social sciences. And we have different types of governance records, records that relate to the operation of governments at local levels to national to international levels. Integrating those different perspectives, the stakeholder perspectives, the evidence from the natural and the social sciences, and the governance records is a challenge. And just as an observation, as an individual, a professor of practice, this is not an academic dialogue. This is roll up your hands. These are real discussions. The academic community has a very fundamental responsibility in convening these dialogues among adversaries and allies because it doesn't have the agendas of government, because it doesn't have the agendas of industry, and because it doesn't have the agendas of NGOs. So I'd like to try and offer you hope and inspiration in going forward. If we look at the situation, how governments normally respond, they respond in terms of urgencies. Urgencies are characteristically defined in terms of security issues. Security, whether it's climate security or food security or human security or national security or social security or cyber security or whatever flavor of security it is, they all have common feature. Security relates to risks of political, economic, or cultural instability. Those risks will always be urgent. But at the same time, because of our global connections on a planetary scale, today, like no time in the history of our civilization, security risks and sustainability issues that operate across generations are simultaneous. The urgencies today exist over security timescales as well as sustainability timescales. And for those of you that are young, just to put things in context, your children will be alive in the 22nd century. Our challenge today is to think across the 21st century. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. All right, thank you, Dr. Berkman. Our second speaker is Dr. Paul Kirshen. Dr. Kirshen has more than 30 years of experience serving as principal investigator of complex interdisciplinary participatory research related to water resources, coastal zones, infrastructure management, and climate variability and change. He is currently professor in the School for the Environment at UMass Boston and academic director of the Sustainable Solutions Lab, also at UMass Boston. Previously, he was a faculty member at the University of New Hampshire and at Tufts University. He was a lead author of the IPCC Fifth Assessment Report and the 2014 U.S. National Climate Assessment. He works at scales ranging from local to international. He received his BS in engineering from Brown University and his MS and PhD in civil engineering from MIT. His talk today, titled Adaptation Approaches, will focus on climate change impacts in Burkina Faso, Egypt, and Boston, and methods of coping with those impacts. Dr. Kirshen, you have 20 minutes.
Thank you very much. So while getting set up, it's a pleasure to be here. It was about 20 years ago this spring that we launched a major study in this room on climate's long-term impacts on Metro Boston. And it was one of the first, if not the first, study of the integrated impacts of climate change on urban area. So it's great to be back here at Tufts. What I'm going to talk about, okay, thank you. Use this. So what I'm going to talk about this afternoon, the next 15 minutes or so, is adaptation. You know, how we're going to adjust to the impacts of climate change. Before I do, I want to mention a couple of things. First of all, I'm going to be talking about ranges of climate changes. So I'm going to talk about, sea level rise at the end of the century of 3 feet or 7 feet, increase in temperature of 2 degrees Celsius or 5 degrees Celsius. So I'm always talking about ranges of changes of impacts. And that's because we really aren't certain what the changes are going to be. And this is partly what makes difficulty so intense for dealing with climate change. Can you hear me okay in the back? Okay. So, and the reason we have this uncertainty is because, as you know, what's driving the climate change is the emission of greenhouse gases, and we don't know what the future of that's going to be. But also, we don't fully understand the climate system. So we have these wonderful models called generalized circulation models of the climate system, which we pump up with CO2 scenarios and see what the changes are. While the models agree on the changes of sign, they don't always agree on the actual values. So there's uncertainty. The other thing I want to point out is, I'm talking about adaptation, a very fine scale. How do we adjust to these impacts of climate change on urban systems? We'll also talk about some agricultural systems. But I want to point out the most important thing we can do right now is, control the emissions of greenhouse gases, mitigation. Because if we do successfully control our greenhouse gases, we may only have 3 feet of sea level rise to deal with at the end of the century instead of 7. We may only have 2 degrees Celsius increase instead of 5. So mitigation is the most important aspect of managing climate. Unfortunately, though, because of the inertia of the climate system, even if we stopped all our emissions of greenhouse gases today, we're still going to have climate change centuries. So we have to adapt to climate change. So I always start off with this slide. So all human and natural systems are tied to climate. And so if climate changes, all the services we get from the built and natural and also social systems is going to change. We have to adjust to these changes. This is called the process of adaptation. And these are some of the attributes we think about when we do adaptation work. First of all, we think about strategies that work over a range of future conditions. We use scenario planning. We use scenarios of climate, scenarios of population growth, scenarios of technology change, and so on. And we think about solutions that work over a range of scenario conditions. And for example, and there are 2 kinds of general solutions. One is like robust. So say we're dealing with coastal flooding. Well, we could build this massive wall, let's say to protect the city of Boston from coastal flooding. Some of you may have seen the article in Sunday's Globe about this wall. So you can build something very massive. Alternative, though, is you can build something small, like only this high, but you make the foundation big enough so you can expand it over time as the climate changes. So it's a flexible approach that's implemented as the climate changes. And the advantage of that is if you build a massive wall or a massive structure, you're making a huge investment, which could have very large, social, economic, and environmental consequences that, you're not even sure you're going to need. Whereas a flexible approach lets you adjust incrementally over climate, or as the climate changes. Also, I'm not going to run through this whole list. We're also looking for solutions that have no regrets and co-benefits. I mean, they make sense now, even if you didn't have climate change, and what you do to protect one system also protects other systems. And also, climate change is not the only threat we're facing. We're also dealing with other issues related to sustainability, like population growth, land use change. So we have to integrate climate change management into that. And also, climate change management adaptation recognizes the adaptive capacity of systems. So essentially, adaptive capacity means, what happens if something is flooded, let's say? How important is it? So if it's a local road in, the backwoods, it's less important than if it's the only road to a hospital. So the only road to the hospital has less adaptive capacity than the country road. And also, generally, wealthier people have more adaptive capacity than poorer people. So you have to think about that when you do adaptation planning. And of course, adaptation planning, Paul was talking on a global scale, global solutions. Okay, adaptation planning is very local. So it has to obviously involve, stakeholders. Okay, so I'm just going to give a couple of examples, I hope. So first one is agriculture in Egypt and climate change. As many of you know, the Nile is the lifeblood of Egypt. And it's going to be, the flow in the Nile is going to be impacted by climate change. Also, the flow in the Nile is going to be impacted by upstream development. So even though there's a set amount of water that Egypt gets every year by treaty, well, first of all, that's no longer maybe possible with climate change as well as upstream development. And so what might happen to the Nile flow? So just look at the far right. There's several scenario values of flow. Remember the scenarios, high and low emissions, all that? So, one scenario of flow that Egypt might get in 2060 might be 70.6 billion cubic meters. Right now, their allocation is 55. So it could go up, but also could go down as low as 35.6. So there's some of the challenges we have with planning. What's going to happen to the flow of the Nile? And then the other thing is one of the most fertile areas of Egypt is the Nile Delta. The Nile is on the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean is hooked to the ocean. Oceans are rising. So parts of the Nile Delta could get flooded. And that would obviously impact a lot of their prime agricultural land. And then, it just shows that. And then also with higher temperatures, with higher temperatures, crop yields go down, also water demands go up. And so it's a positive system of positive feedback, which is not good. And then, so what might happen? Okay, so this is effects on agricultural production in Egypt in 2030. So just look at like the first row, second row, production, okay? So no matter what the scenario is of the flow, whether it gets lower or higher, agricultural production goes down. Also, consumer prices go up, and consumption also goes down, okay? So it's not good. This is only 2030, like perhaps 15 years from now, okay? 2060, again, look at production goes down significantly, prices go up, consumption also goes down, okay? So major threats to the agricultural system of Egypt. So what can be done about this? Okay, some of the things we can think about for Egypt. One is obviously more interbasin cooperation. So how can Egypt think about adjusting to these changes? So improve basin cooperation, improve water pricing, better allocation of water, develop more water supplies, develop more heat-resistant crops, more efficient irrigation, desalinization in the delta, reusing some of their wastewater, disease surveillance systems, and diversification. So these are some of the things Egypt can think about to deal with some of these climate change threats. Okay, another example. How much time do I have left? 10 minutes?
10 minutes.
Okay, great. Okay, another example is dealing with agriculture in Burkina Faso. There's also another project I did here at Tufts. And so Burkina Faso is an African country, and generally all African countries, unfortunately, because of institutional and resource issues, have very low adaptive capacity. And this just shows where Burkina Faso is. It's a little country south of Sahara Desert. It's landlocked. It's one of the poorest of the poor countries in the world. Unfortunately, there's all the attributes of a very poor developing country. The climate of Burkina Faso is characterized by wet season during our summer. The rest of the year it's bone dry. 80% of the population is involved in hand-to-mouth agriculture, and there's very little, traditional economy activities there. Most of it is hand-to-mouth agriculture, growing grains. And this just shows the declining rainfall in one region of Burkina Faso, and this just shows the severe difference between the wet and dry seasons. The upper left is a village in the dry season, and the lower right is the same village, same shot in the wet season, okay? And you notice the color of the slides. I mean, that's the color you see all over Burkina Faso. And I still have that dust in my clothes and my shoes and my lungs probably. Okay, so, and as I pointed out, everything there is, subsistence agriculture, very low levels of mechanization. And so, we got interested in what can we do to improve livelihoods in Burkina Faso, not only now, but also in the future. So one thing we got interested in was, say we provided the farmers with a forecast what the seasonal rainfall was going to be. Because if a farmer knows, any kind of farmer, in the developed world or in the developing world, they have a forecast. There are things they can do, like in Burkina. If they know it's going to be wet, they could plant more highlands. If it's going to be dry, they could plant more lowlands. If it's going to be very dry, they might decide not to plant at all and go work in Côte d'Ivoire. Also, there's some variation in what they can grow. So if they had a forecast, there are some options they can take. And I remember when we started working on this project, we were talking to some elder in a village. This was through his local language, which was then interpreted to French. And he said, we really welcome your help in understanding the use of scientific forecasts because our climate has changed. I wish I had recorded that, but here was some guy about 80 years old who in his lifetime had seen dramatic changes in the climate and saw the value of bringing in scientific technology to help his village. So our challenge was how to take a scientific forecast of the rainfall, developed in the United States or in Medio France or other organizations, and get it in the hands of these subsistence farmers who speak local languages. So I was working with a wonderful anthropologist named Carla Roncoli from the University of Georgia at the time, and we figured out a process on how to do this. So the first thing was how to explain probability to farmers. So we tried a couple of techniques. The technique we decided finally on in the upper right was to put like 100 stickers in a bag and 3 different colors, and they could just pick out and get a sense of the probability of the rainfall. In the lower right and lower left, we also tried spinners, and I remember I actually built the spinner right here at Tufts and took it over with me. And then once they understood the forecast, we then had the local Met Service explain the implications of that forecast, like what the rain might look like through the season, what would be the boundaries of the wet season. You know, these farmers, they're learned by discussion. And then we had the farmers themselves discuss how they would use the forecast and how they would interpret it. You know, we weren't going to tell the farmers what to plant because everyone has their own level of risk. We just wanted to make sure they understood the forecast and they understood their options. And then, you know, this worked. Okay, this is a letter we actually got in 2000, written in French. And it said, you know, beginning of the wet season, farmers were afraid because of the problematic onset of the rains. So that some farmers had to plant 5 consecutive times with effective establishment of the season in July. Today, we thank God that until now we continue to receive rain and the harvest will be good this year. There is proof, and he showed this field. So the forecast for that year was generally for good rains. And these farmers just hung in there and believed our forecast, and it was a very successful season. We did this for 8 years, and one of those 8 years we had a blown forecast. We forecast good rains, it actually came out bad. The actual rain was poor. But the farmers said, you know, you guys don't create the rain, you know, God creates the rain, and so that's okay. This is a strategy that meant in Burkina Faso to deal with present climate change as well as future climate change. Now, I just want to zip to Boston, okay? I have about 5 minutes left? Okay. So, Boston in last fall just started a large effort called Climate Ready Boston. They have a website, Climate Ready Boston, on how they're going to study what the impacts of climate change are going to be on Boston and how they can deal with it. And UMass Boston, because we're a state university in Boston, we're heavily involved in this. So, Boston is facing 4 major threats: sea level rise, coastal storms, extreme precipitation, extreme temperature. And I'm just going to talk about the flooding aspect, okay? But believe me, Boston is threatened by all these as well. So in terms of the flooding, this just shows, I know the blue doesn't show up very well. Forget about the shades of blue. But generally this shows the extent of flooding you might see with a large flood in Boston if it occurred sometime in the 20s, 30s to 2050s. Again, we don't know exactly when because we're uncertain of how much the sea level rise is going to be. But we know there'll be a certain amount of sea level rise between 2030 and 2050, and the flooding in Boston might look like this. And I'm sorry it's so light. And then here's more color, right? 2050 is 2100, and then sometime after 2070, okay? So you see large portions of the city being flooded by a major storm. And there's when I started working on climate change, we were mainly worried about the impacts on natural systems like agriculture, forestry, fisheries. And then, because I'm an engineer, I got worried about impacts on infrastructure. Now I'm very concerned about those, but also impacts on people, and particularly the idea of social justice. So one of the things the city has done is they've mapped out where in the city there are peoples that are particularly vulnerable to social justice vindicators, like people of color, low income, limited English, sickness, number of kids, old people, and so on. So the city now knows where a lot of these vulnerable populations are. As I said earlier, vulnerable populations have less adaptive capacity than wealthier ones. So we're particularly concerned about, let's say, flooding impacts here. And also the city, at the same time, is also looking at these problems of income inequality in Boston and also structural racism. And the solutions to the racism and the inequality are these 4 efforts. And the last one is a connected adaptive city. So the separate group in Boston that's looking at racism and income inequality recognizes that climate change is also a threat to these populations, and we've got to have a city that is not only climate change resilient, but also socially resilient. Okay, so how's the city thinking about dealing with flooding? So one of the things we think about in climate change adaptation is the concept of multiple levels of, how much time do I have? Great, okay. So one of the concepts we think about in climate change management is the idea of multiple levels of safety. No longer can we, if you live behind a levee, because the flows are changing, sea levels are rising, your safety is no longer guaranteed. So we need to think about systems that are what I call safe to fail, not fail safe. So for the city is thinking about what they call multiple layers of climate readiness. So you might have, walls along the coast, but also floodproofing inland, elevation, and so on. So you have a whole network of strategies that if one fails, you have a backup plan and so on, okay? So you have multiple levels of safety. And one of the first aspects of these multiple levels is trying to block off the ways floodwaters gets into Boston. So if you look at the Boston coastline, if you look at it closely, you'll see there are areas where it's low, and that's where the floodwater would come in. And so one strategy is just to block off these low areas with flood walls. But again, the idea of make them flexible. So build them like this high now, but design them to expand over time. But we're not going to make these walls ugly, monolithic structures. We're going to make these walls have co-benefits. So people who live on the coast want to see the ocean. So let's put viewing sections in them. Walls doesn't have to be ugly, just be a raised road. You can put, we can build up beaches. We can landscape them. We can make, here's a park bench which flips up to be a flood wall. Here's a flexible flood wall. And then, so all sorts of ways we can make these walls have benefits to the community. We can connect parts of the community with bike paths and walking trails and gardens. And finally, there are some things we just can't protect with these walls. So therefore, we need site-specific strategies. And there are a whole slew of these. It's like wet and dry floodproofing. There's floating homes, amphibious homes, all sorts of creative things we're thinking about now to protect buildings that are we can't protect with these more regional strategies. So I thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to talking more with you.
All right, so thank you, Dr. Kirshen. Our third and final speaker for the panel will be Dr. David Titley. Dr. Titley serves as a professor of international affairs and a professor of practice of meteorology at Penn State. He's also the founding director of Penn State's Center for Solutions to Weather and Climate Risk. Dr. Titley served as a naval officer for 32 years, rising to the rank of Rear Admiral. In 2009, he initiated and led the U.S. Navy Task Force on Climate Change. Dr. Titley earned his bachelor's from Penn State and a PhD in meteorology from the Naval Postgraduate School. He's a fellow of the American Meteorological Society. His talk today, Climate Risk and National Security, Not People, Not Polar Bears, will focus on the security aspects of climate change. Dr. Titley, you have 20 minutes.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks certainly to the organizers for both inviting me and also working with my schedule so we could actually do this, because otherwise it wasn't going to work. Although we actually did not coordinate our talks, one of the lessons in life you'll quickly learn is, well, there are two lessons. First is, thanks to Dr. Berkman, I did not have to be the speaker after Admiral Stavridis. You never want to be that. The second is it's sometimes better to be lucky than good. So by luck, actually all our talks, I think, fit together pretty nicely. So yeah, I'm going to talk about security and climate, but I'm not going to talk about climate as an environmental issue. So this is not, if you were looking for the session in which we get up and hug the polar bear, this is not it, but it is a security risk. And not to get too geeky, right on slide 1 here, but I talk about climate as a risk and not a threat. And actually, this audience should really know the difference. A threat is what? Capability times intention, right? Climate doesn't have an intention. It's there. But a risk is probability times consequences. And if the probability of basically adverse things keeps coming up and the consequences keep getting worse. So I look at this as a risk and even an accelerating risk, but I don't talk about it as a threat. And honestly, if you get to the Pentagon, there's already threat fatigue. They're not looking for more threats. Okay, we'll just go through very quickly these. And you've kind of heard this already, so I'm going to just flash through these slides. But yes, I'm going to talk about climate, and I even have a couple things in which we have moving pieces of the atmosphere and the cryosphere, so we'll check that block. But there's, as you've heard from both this panel and certainly from our keynote, there's a lot of other things that when you get to senior policy-making levels, you better be considering. So, you know, sometimes, honestly, the climate folks kind of come across as a single-issue interest, and they're well-meaning, and they're very dedicated and passionate about this, but no big problems in the world that we have to solve, honestly, are single issues. They all interact. So some of the things, we've already talked about these. How do we have adequate energy, food, water? I would argue water is the nexus of that. The world is globalized, whether we like it or not, whether we think it should be or should not be. Post-World War II, the world is globalized. Technology marches on. My students think that this is my phone here on the left. It's not, at least as of 2 weeks ago, it's not. Technology does many things. We heard about cyber. We heard about some of the challenges with cyber. I would argue one of the many things technology's done is it's forced transparency, whether governments want it or not. Snowden come to mind anywhere? So what that means is whatever we do or do not do in the realm of addressing these climate risks, everyone's going to know. Whether we tell them or not, people are going to figure this stuff out. Population, already being mentioned. So yes, climate has changed many times in the past, but this time as it changes, we're going to deal with a world of 7, 8, 9 billion people, not a world of a few million people. That's a big difference. And then at least our self-talk for quite a long time has now been, this is the G20 ministers, is that we're collectively in the West out of money. So we're going to deal with all this stuff, and we say we're financially constrained. Now, are we or are we not? I'm not going to really comment on that, but that's our self-talk. Okay, so climate fits into, again, these broader issues, which we've already heard a fair amount about today. So one of the things that you find out when you deal with people like Admiral Stavridis and myself is hopefully we're not like the dimmest battle lanterns on the ship, hopefully. But our intentions span collectively of flag and general officers is analogous to that of a gnat. So unless you can kind of pretty concisely say why this is an issue, people lose track and they'll go on to the next issue because there's a lot of issues. So really I have 3 words that I put for why do we care about climate, and very frankly it's very simply, it's people, it's water, it's change. And really this is about people and not the polar bears. Yes, there are environmental and there are significant environmental issues, but I would argue if we really cared as a society, we would have fixed this by now. We haven't done so well on that. But I do tell people this is about you and me and our families, our children, our grandchildren, the people who live in our towns, our villages, our states. This is really going to affect all of us in addition to the polar bears. I use water as an integrating principle. You can use other things, but if you think about the water, it's really how it's distributed, too much, too little, wrong place, wrong time. Salty where it used to be fresh, wet where it used to be dry, liquid where it used to be solid as the ice melts. Even the chemistry itself of the oceans are changing, and that's having a significant impact on food webs. And then finally, and we've heard about this a little bit, it's not the fact that we have climate. We've always had climate, and unless anybody here from either San Diego or Honolulu, Hawaii? No. Okay, nobody here has ideal climate. Those 2 places are pretty close. I'm in central Pennsylvania. Normally, we don't see the sun from November to March. It's gray, it's cold, it's miserable. But it was stable. We knew what grew. We knew when to harvest. We knew when to plant. If you lived by the coast, you knew that that port was going to be there and the sea wasn't going to go down 10 meters or up 15 meters. We are now changing and rapidly changing that climate. And literally, we have not done that in human civilization. We've kind of built human civilization on the implicit premise of climate stability when we came out of the Ice Age. And if we just left everything alone, we'd have about another 20,000 years of roughly stability, and then we'd actually get colder again. But now we have kind of hit the gas pedal, and we're going to warm, and we are warming pretty fast. Okay. Hopefully all the Academy midshipmen know what this is, because you guys are learning this again, right, after a 15-year hiatus. I hope so. It's a sextant, so that you can do celestial navigation. Why do I have that up there? My first, and I would argue my most fun job in the Navy actually was not as an admiral, although that was fun. But being a navigator on an old destroyer, no GPS. I know it's hard to imagine there was no GPS at some time. And you actually had to use this. And one thing you learned, if you didn't want to become a Walmart greeter the next week, was look at all the data, but don't believe any one thing. And that's really kind of how I approached climate change when Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Gary Ruffhead asked me to look at this for the Navy. I'm not going to go through the science, and actually Dr. Berkman's done a really, really nice job of some of that. But just very simply, when you're thinking about science writ large, climate, or almost anything else, you can kind of think of these three legs. Do we understand the fundamental physics and theory? Do the observations, does the world support that or not support that? And ultimately, can we predict that? And the answer is yes, yes, and yes. If you are interested, we can talk about it in Q&A. We can talk about it at the 4 p.m. breakout session, but in the interest of time, I'm going to keep going here. Okay, so as a security risk, why do we talk about this? Well, here's, just so that you know, the IC, that's the intelligence community, pardon the acronym there. This is out on the web, still out on the web, from 21 September 2016, and you can see this came from our Director of National Intelligence and something called the National Intelligence Council. So really, in English, what does that mean? This means all of our intel folks kind of got together and said, hey, whether I work for state or defense or the CIA or whatever, I kind of agree with this. And at the bottom line, this is kind of what they said. It's talking about threats to stability, social, political tensions. You know, there's that food. I would argue energy is in there, health is in there, water is in there. How does it affect the economy? And then again, what we talked about a little bit already today is surprises. Turns out nobody's perfect at looking at the future, but usually we're smart enough to realize that sometimes we can be surprised, and those surprises are not always good. Okay, so that's how the intelligence community views this. Here's Titley's kind of caveman simple way. And this is basically a slide that I presented at the International Sea Power Symposium conference. Admiral Greenert, CNO Greenert, asked me to come up and lead a discussion with about 70 heads of navies on climate as a maritime security risk. And I would put in the rows here really the four things when you sort of break all this kind of 100,000 foot level geostrategery down into what does this mean. Arctic. The Arctic is just fundamentally changing. We'll talk a bunch about that. Impacts to bases, impacts to our own infrastructure. We just heard our previous speaker talk about how do you manage some of those risks. Disaster relief. We're very good at that. Honestly, Western navies, U.S. militaries, we're very good at this. But does it become a capacity issue? And then some of these geostrategic threats in which climate may not be the cause, probably isn't the cause, but it can be one of the contributing causes, and it can tip that proverbial straw at the camel's back. And we'll talk actually how this played out in Syria. Okay, let's see if I can make this run. There we go. So what this is my one science geeky slide. It's pretty geeky, I have to admit that. This is unclassified polar orbiter images of actually microwave. So you can look through clouds, you can look through night, that's kind of cool. The North Pole's right in the center here. So Greenland at 4 p.m., Alaska at 8 p.m., there's all of Russia. What it's showing is two things. Here's the date coming down through here. I'll let it run a couple times. The ice is colored between blue and white. And what the difference is white is the old, hard, thick, multi-year ice. It's been up there for a long time. Watch what happens as we go through. And anybody here who's an oceanographer or a physical scientist, this is like great stuff because you can watch sort of all the patterns. Watch what happens when we get to 2007. So 05, 2006, watch what happens. Wham, where'd the ice go? Tries to come back, like my stock market portfolio tried to. And then in 2012, there's almost none. And if I updated this, there's even less now. So this, ladies and gentlemen, in half a generation, we have had a very fundamental change in the Arctic. And just this year, you may or may not have known, we've had 3 separate occasions in the middle of the winter when the North Pole has been at or above freezing. That would be roughly equivalent to in Boston having days at about between 88 and 92 between Christmas and President's Day. That's the kind of changes that are going on in the Arctic right now. So that's what's driving this. And for all the midshipmen here, the reason the Navy got into the climate thing is because of the Arctic, because we saw there was literally an ocean opening up. And I told CNO Roughhead that the officer who will be CNO when we have no ice in the Arctic in the summer, he or she is already serving. They're out on some ship, they're on a submarine, they're in a SEAL team, they're in an aircraft squadron, they're in the Navy today, and they will be dealing with an ice-free Arctic when they're sitting in the Pentagon and a member of the Joint Staff. Okay, we could literally do a week on the Arctic. I just don't have time to do that. But there's still very little infrastructure. Paradoxically, as the ice comes out, that means there's more open water. All the midshipmen know more open water, more fetch, worse waves. If you're below freezing, more ice, surface icing. How do we get rid of ice on our surface ships in today's modern 21st century high-tech Navy? You know, with a seaman or a bosun mate. I can call them bosun mates again, right? Okay, good. Thank God for that. Okay, good. You know, with a mallet. Not really high-tech. We probably want to think about that kind of stuff. I'll just talk a little bit about that. That's Russia. But that's Russia as if you were standing at the North Pole looking southward. Got to look southward if you're at the North Pole. And no ice. So one thing you see is that coast kind of is like the Gulf of Mexico on steroids. 3 rivers, each the size and scope of the Mississippi flowing in, huge mineral deposits, natural gas deposits, some oil, a lot of natural gas. They're developing it, but you know, we developed our Gulf of Mexico. It's not unreasonable for the Russians to try to develop that. The other thing that's not there anymore, as we saw, is the ice. The ice is gone. And for 1,000 years, for the history of Russia, their natural northern flank defense has been that ice. So as you see them build things up, and Admiral Stavridis kind of said, you know, try to put yourself in somebody else's shoes. You know, we say, oh my God, the Russians are building their military capability along this coast. They are. I mean, even if they deny it, they are. I would argue, though, they're scared. They're paranoid. They're Russians, right? Sorry, Russians. And I think it is because they realize they've lost their natural defense, at least in part, and they want to make sure the West doesn't come over the top. I try to tell my Russian friends, look, we can't even find the Arctic, so you're probably pretty safe, but, you know, but that's okay. All right, trade routes, not today, not tomorrow, but probably in about 20 to 25 years, that green line, seasonally, late summer, early fall, will open up. And that will fundamentally change Northern Hemisphere trade routes. It's not going to happen today, and sometimes you hear people like breathlessly counting ships today through the Bering Strait. Hold your breath. But this is going to happen, and you'll start seeing Dutch Harbor potentially being a terminus. Iceland is already trying to position itself to be that other terminus there. I kind of mentioned this, you know, so here just a couple days ago about the Russians building their air defense shield. We need to think hard about why they're doing this and what they're doing this before just jumping to a conclusion of how it would look from our perspective. Am I trying to say the Russians have no anything but benign intentions? That's not what I'm saying, but I think it is worth trying to put your shoes of a senior policy person in Moscow and thinking about this. Okay, we have a 2013 DoD Arctic strategy. It was updated actually just a couple of months ago. It was released a few weeks ago. It is out on the net. It's on the internet. You can read as well as I can kind of the desired end states. Let me stop on the Arctic. I'm going to talk about sea level for just a little bit. Oftentimes we think of Bangladesh, and yes, they have a big issue. Or every few years we have a big international climate meeting, and one of the small island nations becomes the rock star of the world for about 48 hours. I went to Copenhagen, so it was Tuvalu's turn. Okay, we should consider now, I usually ask when I give this talk, where is this? And normally if it's not a military audience, nobody has any idea where this is. I'll bet at least half the people in here can recognize that's Diego Garcia. And you all know here that Diego Garcia is an island where basically every significant, that has been used in every significant Department of Defense operation for the last 40 or 50 years out in Southwest Asia there. It's British. As long as we're nice to the birds and the fishes and the turtles, the Brits let us do basically anything we want to, so we're nice to the birds and fishes and the turtles. Anyone been out there? I'll bet a bunch of people have probably. No? It's about 1 to 1.5 meters above sea level. So when I ask my friends in policy in the Pentagon, so what are you going to do when this goes underwater? They look at their watch and realize they have a really important meeting and kind of like tell me to go away, because it's hard. There are no great options. The options that are out there are really expensive and probably reduce U.S. military options. That's a climate issue. The Air Force spending a space fence. We need the Air Force, we need the space fence. It's a really good thing. Did 100 pages environmental impact study. They're going to put one on Kwajalein here. Guess what they forgot to look at? Sea level. It's only $1 billion though, right? So now the contractor's pointing at the Air Force is pointing at the contractor. Everybody says, well, geez, we didn't really think about that. Not smart, not really smart. And the right-hand side, this is for my Navy friends. This is the no good deed goes unpunished slide. Big hurricane coming up the East Coast. The Navy forecasters know it. We get the fleet out of Norfolk. So the sailors kiss their spouses, say, hey, honey, have fun in the hurricane. I'll be at sea. And they go park their cars down on Pier 12 or just off of Pier 12. Nobody really thought about the storm surge. And the thing is, it's what you're seeing in Norfolk, is a smaller and smaller and weaker hurricane is producing that kind of storm surge. So ultimately, we've got a hell of a problem in Norfolk. We're going to have to fix it. Okay, it is a domestic issue, as is already being talked about, and I tell the DOD, if you wait long enough, and there is a lot of good reasons to wait, you don't want to spend what we call ahead of need, but if you wait long enough, you're going to be in the line with Boston and New York and Baltimore and Washington and Charleston and Jacksonville, not to mention Miami and Tampa and New Orleans. I can go around the coast, because they're all going to realize they too have a hell of a problem, and they have a lot of people who vote. So where's the money coming from? Where's the money coming from? It's going to be a big deal. Okay, geostrategic risk, I'll probably have to stop about here. I want to go through this very quickly, though, because, and this is really being politicized or almost weaponized by a lot of people. There's quite a few on the conservative side who say climate had nothing to do with ISIS whatsoever. I got to testify before Senator Cruz, and we had that conversation. Senator Sanders, when he was running for president, said climate change caused ISIS, period, full stop. With all due respect to Senator Sanders, I think he's about as wrong as Senator Cruz. So I'm equally unpopular with everybody, and that's probably about the right place to be. It's one of the links in a complex chain of events. You go all the way from when Assad, and we've already heard about Assad, he's not the nicest person in the world, got into power. He wanted to be self-sufficient. Anyone been out in the Eastern Med, on cruise, whatever? It's kind of a desert, okay? So, you would really want the advisors to say, boss, we're kind of a desert, maybe that's not our best strategy, but it's Assad. So probably if you like both your career and your head, you say, boss, you are a smart, powerful, and handsome man, and that is a great idea, we'll get right on it. And they did. By the 90s, they were, in fact, self-sufficient in food. but it came at the cost of draining aquifers and draining rivers. That's great right until it isn't. It's like spending every penny you have in your checkbook and going through your line of credit, and then the furnace breaks and it's cold. Now you're kind of screwed, right? Well, that's kind of what happened to these guys. But there was a lot of other stuff, nothing to do with climate, like the Iraq War, like 1 million refugees. But then you have this very bad drought, very hot, very dry. I will not bore you with the details, but there's a big climate fingerprint on that particular drought. And you dump another 750,000 internally displaced refugees, the farmers, into the cities. It's Assad. He's not taking care of anyone. So now you have desperate, desperate people just trying to keep their family literally alive from dying of thirst and starvation. And you have a group like Al-Qaeda Syria, ISIS, that says, join us, we'll take care of you. You know, it's easy to sit here at Tufts and say, oh, you know, we wouldn't fall for that. If you were in that position, who knows what we would do. But put yourself in those people's shoes. Okay, what to do? It's teamwork, it's leadership. The only reason I'm talking about this is because of that guy in the top right, CNO Roughhead. And at least, you know, unlike academia in the Pentagon, if the boss is interested, you are fascinated. You know, that's probably why, you know, Admiral Stavridis got hired, because the president thought, oh, maybe I can try that. I know at Penn State it doesn't work. Okay, we'll wrap up here. And it's teamwork. You cannot do this by yourself. Okay, the DoD actually has a pretty good directive on what to do. We'll see if they do it, but they have a good directive. We'll keep going. We talked a little bit about how do you get better nearer-term predictions. There's a program that the Department of Defense has been funding for 5 years. The C stands for capability and not climate. Climate isn't mentioned in this. It gets fully funded every year with no controversy. If you can't get them for murder, get them for tax evasion. Okay, there are surprises. Watch this in the 21st century. Geoengineering, climate intervention, intentional modification of the climate to undo the large-scale unintentional modification. What could go wrong with that? Okay, Greenland. Watch Greenland. They want to be independent. Oil prices collapse. They were going to do it on that. They keep looking. And it's going, this is risk management. I could go through the details, but really what we're talking about is a risk management issue. I don't usually like words on slides, but I love these quotes. I would argue that both Admiral Nimitz and Secretary Shultz neither are really big tree huggers, but they have some great advice that would apply to this challenge here. Okay, the U.S., we can figure this out. We will figure this out, but we need to be focused. We do amazing things when we're focused. We got to get focused. And with that, I will stop, and thank you very much.
No, you can't. I have no idea how to turn it on. Oh, all right, there we go. You know. So it looks like we're running a bit late, so I'll just kick off the Q&A with a question of my own. So, and this is just addressed to the entire panel, so you know, whoever wishes to talk about it, by all means. So we've heard that climate change is this long-term problem that requires this very long-term planning and policy investment, and especially Dr. Berkman, you discussed this. But however, at least in democracies, our national priorities and policies and investments are clearly subject to change with new elections, which they do with some regularity. So my question is, if we were to hypothetically find ourselves in a situation where the government is either denying or not addressing climate change, what should the priorities of those be in academia and policy development, in international organizations, NGOs, the military perhaps, so that we can move forward as quickly as possible to prepare for climate change's impacts and to reduce its total future impact?
Sure, I'll start. This is the wonderful thing about being retired and working in academia is you can actually talk now. So, and I'm sure my panelists will have a whole bunch to add to this. So the first thing is that you learn in these big, big challenges is there are good days and sometimes there are not so good days. But persistence counts. You know, I mean, you think of like, to really move these issues, you only have to be right a couple times. And the great thing is with persistence, you get an unlimited number of at-bats. You don't get, it's not 3 strikes and you're out. As long as you keep working this, you're okay. Framing counts, being constructive in framing. I'm pretty sure that in this hypothetical administration that we're talking about, hypothetically, they probably don't respond to threats very well or to demeaning, even if it's fun. But you know, take the high ground, stay constructive. The facts on the ground, as sometimes we like to talk about in the military, will move this issue. The only question is there's a saying in naval aviation, I'm sure some of you guys know, that, you know, the 2 things of no use to a naval aviator, altitude above you and runway behind you. And yeah, think of that the next time you're on United. We're putting runway behind us. So whether it's the adaptation on the seawall, whether it's getting ready for the Arctic, you know, pick the specific issue, you know, we will have less time to do that, which means we'll probably spend more money, ultimately. We'll probably not spend it as smartly, because it'll be in a semi or full-blown crisis mode. It's kind of the American way, though, right? If you look at history, that's what we do. We ignore things, we ignore things, we ignore things. It's like, oh my God, and then we bring the full weight and force of America to bear. So I would say you got to keep the faith. We have to keep working these. Congress is key. You know, and I know that may sound like Congress, you know, who wants them? You know, but they are key. And if you look at military history, look at nuclear power in the Navy. The Navy loves to take full credit for nuclear power. Aren't we smart? Aren't we technical? Read Rickover's biography. You'll find that nuclear power was jammed down the throat of the Navy. They hated it. They hated Rickover. But Rickover was smart enough to be 1 step ahead of the Navy. Every time the Navy tried to fire him, he went to Congress and they had to promote him to another star. And over time, they realized, hey, this guy's not as crazy as he thought. This is actually a pretty good thing. And now, of course, the Navy's totally embraced it, right? I mean, we just can't imagine a Navy without nuclear power. Congress made the Navy do that. Goldwater Nichols, not perfect, but my guess is we'd all be in our silos. That came from Congress. It did not come from the administration. So I continue to work Congress. Congress does respond to constituents. It's why I do a lot of public outreach. When enough people in the public care enough, so it's not just caring a little, but enough have to care enough. Not everybody totally, but enough to care enough, this will flip, and it could flip pretty quickly. Let me stop there and give everybody else a chance.
As to your question, the word or the phrase climate change is redundant. Climate is inherently dynamic, so climate change is redundant. It's inherently dynamic. It's like saying the sky is blue. It's blue because that's what we defined it. The climate is operating on a planetary scale. It's dynamic and will always be dynamic. And the challenges we face, you know, we had an agreement in Paris. The reality is a single agreement isn't going to solve climate. Climate's going to continue to change. The solution to climate on a planetary scale is a process. And the process has to be operating in response to the changing system itself. So I think part of the discussion, whether it's an administration or a government in power or not, it's a public dialogue in terms of understanding that we're now beginning to think on a planetary scale. And climate is the best example of that. It's hard. We don't see climate changing in front of us. We can perhaps easier to see populations changing in our cities. Both are happening on a planetary scale. And so the challenge we face as a civilization is to think and operate on a planetary scale. We're just in our infancy. And so in terms of any one administration, the climate operates over decades to centuries. That's the way the climate operates. It doesn't operate like weather systems on a regional basis. It operates over decades to centuries. The solutions to climate in our world have to operate across decades to centuries.
Yeah, I'm just going to, it's probably been said before, but, the mayors of the nation's cities, they manage the infrastructure. So they are feeling these impacts, and they're taking action whether they're in Texas or Florida or California or Massachusetts. And so, for example, here in Boston, our mantra is we don't want another Sandy here. And that's what we're working very hard to avoid. And so, the infrastructure managers, the city engineers, all those people, they realize we're going to have to deal with the climate change. And also they're realizing they have to deal with this problem without federal support. So we're thinking now about ways to innovatively finance on a municipal and state level adaptation to climate change, because we know that's how it's going to get done.
All right, so we're going to open up for discussion, or for questions. We have a time for a couple of questions, it looks like. So if you want to line up behind the mics and keep your questions as short as possible, since we have about 10 minutes, it looks like, and we'll start on the right.
Hi, my name is Allison Bogie. I'm a freshman at Tufts studying international relations, and I had a question for Dr. Kirshen. You mentioned a lot about adaptive capacity, and so I was wondering what role does economic development play in climate change mitigation?
Yeah, so I think by climate change mitigation, you mean dealing with the impacts of climate change, right? So obviously, economic development, if handled correctly, can do a lot to increase adaptive capacity. So that's why it's really important, let's say when I'm working in Burkina Faso, that not only are we giving these people the forecast, we're also giving them the skills to improve their livelihoods given these forecasts. So economic development, social development have huge roles to play in helping us respond to climate. Because as we saw in Katrina, and we also saw it in Sandy, if a community had cohesion, it stuck together and it really had less impacts on them. So economic development is really important. Does that help you? And good luck.
All right, one on the left.
Thank you. My name is Erin. Thank you guys for being here. I'm with the delegation from Trinity College in Dublin. My question is mostly for Dr. Berkman, but please feel free to weigh in, everyone. You speak about science as a way to build common interests between different governments around the world. However, from the U.S. to Brazil and Nigeria and India, many of the governments are elected by a base of constituents who view the world through a religious worldview. Do you believe that there is a way to appeal through religion for a common care of our common planet, or is religion merely an obstacle to be overcome in terms of caring for the earth that we live on?
So most of the people in the world, I would imagine, have some religious base. And so religion is fundamental to whatever decision processes that we operate. I would note that the Pope, the current Pope, has an encyclical that creates a scientific academy for the natural sciences and another one for the social sciences. So for a large portion of the world, there is a sense of science. If we look into the Muslim world, there's a book, 1001 Inventions, that was produced a number of years ago. 1,000 years ago, they were street lights in Middle East and so on and so forth. Science has been a component of our society through time. And if we think, education, getting jobs and so on and so forth, I would argue that the most basic feature of an education is to teach yourself. What you learn today becomes the basis of what you learn tomorrow. And science, as a process, is based on inquiry, where the questions generate answers, and those answers generate new questions, and it's continuously evolving. And so part of the solution, this issue, in terms of religion and science, is not to be at each other's throats and to say one's right or another's right, but to think in ways that are helpful to the world we live in, and particularly over time and into the distant future.
Thank you.
Can I just add something? Yes. Okay, so water is one of the systems most impacted by climate change. In most of the world's religions, water plays a central part. And so I think there's inherent respect of water by most religions. And so I think that, helps overcome the possible religious obstacle to dealing with an issue like this, particularly in terms of water management, which is one of the major stresses because of climate change.
I've probably done about a dozen talks with different religious groups. So there's a Catholic Climate Covenant, which works this through the Roman Catholic faith, but also the Jewish faith, fundamentalist Christians, Muslims, and we'd have none with a PhD here and myself here. And really what you're doing is you align message and messenger. Some people respond to science, some respond to military, some respond to health, some respond to big business, some respond to religion. And what we see, I think, is a convergence when you align message and messengers. We can talk to our respective people with whom we have credibility, rightly or wrongly, but coming to a common, hey, this is an issue, we need to manage it. So I'm all for organized religion, working with them to solve this.
All right. I'll take the next one on the right.
Thank you. My name is George Filatov. I'm from Russian delegation from RANEPA, Russian Presidential Academy of Public Service. First of all, thank you for all your discussions. And one question about Arctic. In the morning, we had a small conversation with Mr. Berkman during the dinner. So I would like, first of all, to ask Admiral about his view, because he presented the point that I'm interested in, because about in Russia there are a lot of talks about trade on the great Arctic route and the perspective. So that's why we are building not only military, we are achieving the icebreakers. We had a big fleet of icebreakers, but not only countries that are on the Arctic, like Canada, Greenland, Iceland, and so on, but also not Arctic countries such China are looking through. So my question is, from the military perspective, from the United States perspective, how do you consider that non-Arctic states want to be more engaged in the exploitation or exploitation of this part of the world?
Okay, thanks very much. It's a great question. I guess first let me just make a very brief comment on the shipping. I mean, what we've seen is on the Northern Sea route, which for everybody else, that's the route that goes over the top of Russia. Basically can start in the Nordic countries and ultimately goes out through the Bering Sea into the Pacific. A lot of traffic, but most of that traffic actually was internal to Russia, not too much going all the way this year. So I still think that there'll be little bits and pieces. Of course, many non-climate factors like sanctions impact the amount of tonnage that go on there. But ultimately, that route across is going to open up. And that's, if I was a business person in Moscow managing the Northern Sea route, that's my strategic threat. The ice is going to go. The part about other countries, I think it's going to happen. So I think it's not that you can keep them out. It's international waters. It would be like trying to keep people out of the Mediterranean. That's not going to happen. It's how do we manage that? What are the common rules? UN Convention on the Law of the Sea is a great start. Yes, I wish my country would formally ratify it, but I think everybody knows that the U.S. abides by the contents of it, even though our Senate has not acceded to that treaty. We have signed it, though. But that's really a good baseline. Arctic Council is very, very useful for talking about these non-security issues, but very substantive: search and rescue, oil spill, environmental protection. And it's to what we've heard, I think, earlier. I think Dr. Berkman brought out, how do you balance national interests versus global commons? It is one of the global commons. It will be used as such. And it's going to be up to all of us to manage it. The Arctic Council is doing good, but if the Arctic Council is perceived as not doing well, other countries aren't going to sit by and just let us screw it up.
Thank you.
All right, we'll take the question on the left. This will have to be the last question, I'm afraid.
Sorry.
We're long on time.
Okay, hi, I'm Sophia. I'm also from the Trinity College Dublin delegation. I have a question because I was missing a little bit of the risks of the climate change. Like, we in Europe, we are struggling already with the refugees, but we are also considering climate refugees coming from Africa and so on. Do you know how we can prepare and for what? Because we don't want to have wars for food and water, and also our children in the next generation. I mean, you mentioned teamwork, so we should all work together as a team to help those suffering with climate change in those countries? Is there anything approaches that have been made already?
Let me start, but I think some of the other panelists had some great ideas. So, talking about some of these very local types of things, that's what it ultimately comes down to, is really understanding the specific circumstances if you're in a country and trying to understand how to make their water go further. I sometimes talk about on the food side, this is almost a race between the climate changing and the geneticists. Now in Europe, I know GMOs are like a dirty word, but the fact is do you want to feed, do you want to eat or not? It's going to come down to that. So we're going to have to, manage risks. Not to say that other things are not risky. I put sort of the refugees in that geostrategic bucket that I had on my slide there, but those are that's an outcome when we don't do very well at managing the risks. So it's really being able to understand how changes in rainfall, changes in heat impact agriculture, energy, food, health, and then work on managing those changes while at the same time working on the root cause. And the root cause is, we all know, we need to decarbonize the world's energy structure. But at the same time, we have to work on these daily problems because they're not going to go away by themselves.
Migration, refugees is a great question. The UN High Commission on Refugees identified that last year the number of people migrating around the world was larger than during World War II. So put things in context. In terms of solutions and discussions, any solution or discussion about migration or refugees will be incomplete if it's not considered in the context of global human population growth. So the time frame is not just the moment. And so this isn't something that will happen over a political time scale. This has to happen in relation to global timescales, which are decades into the future. This is a perspective. We're still struggling as a civilization to move beyond thinking in terms of security timescales. The reality is we have to begin to operate with the same level of urgency across generations. Your children will be alive in the 22nd century. You have interest to your children, and I would imagine that publics around the world would have same interest in the welfare of their children. And this is the time frame of the dialogue that has yet to happen.
Just add a couple of comments. As Ellen pointed out, there are certain things we can do to limit the migration, improve water supplies, things like that, improve food supply in these local countries. But eventually that's not going to happen. People are going to lose their traditional resource-based livelihoods, and they're going to have to move. And so they're going to move to cities. And so if you're going to start thinking about planning our cities that can handle these increases in population, densification, and how are we going to do that? And so fortunately, within cities, there are all sorts of ways to improve resource flows. There's water reuse, water recycling. So if we think about these migrants going to move to cities, I think we can build our cities if we start thinking ahead to handle these increased number of people. We have to think ahead, which we're not very good at as a to do, unfortunately.
Thank you.
All right, so I think that's all the time we have. I think we'd probably talk about this for the rest of the conference, but we do have other panelists who are eager to talk. If you want to continue discussing the topic, Dr. Titley will be having a breakout session from 4 to 5:30, I believe, during our breakout sessions. On behalf of the EPIIC program, I'd like to thank our three speakers for taking the time to come speak to us today and share knowledge with us, so let's have a round of applause for them. So thank you all for attending the session. The next session will be starting very shortly in 5 minutes.
In 5 minutes, there's coffee and water outside.
It'll be Identity, Integration, and the Future of the Nation State. All right.
Good job.